Okay. Welcome once again, ladies and gentlemen, to the Adventures in Historyland YouTube channel. Today, I'm joined by Professor Charles Esdaile, and who is the author of the book on the Peninsular War. And in a way, that phrase is going to sum up a lot of what is going to follow, because when I say the book, in practical terms, it is the only book that is widely available on the Peninsular War, and the only one that does not just sort of run through the Duke of Wellington's battles and tries to paint a bigger picture of it. Charles, pleasure to have you talking to me today.
Thank you.
Today we're talking about Spanish generals and myths about the Peninsular War. And so what do you think, where would you like to run back to give a little perspective?
Well, you really need to rethink the Spanish Uprising in 1808. The tradition that we have is of the Spanish people absolutely outraged at the hijacking of the monarchy by Napoleon, and they rise and revolt, no holds barred, in this ferocious war to the death against the French. This begins in Madrid on the 2nd of May 1808, which that's actually 3 weeks or so before the main uprisings take place. But you get this uprising in Madrid, which is commemorated by Goya. This concept of this people's war against Napoleon is essentially a 19th century invention. It simply did not happen like that. What you've got to understand is that in the period from essentially the time of the French Revolutionary Wars onwards, Spain had been having an absolutely dreadful time. First of all, she's involved in the war with France, 1793 to 95, a war, incidentally, in which she did pretty well.
I was going to say, actually, nobody. I don't know of any books about that. I've never read one, but I have read that the troops they deployed, for instance, to Toulon, did very well.
Yeah, and when they invade Roussillon in southeastern France, southern France, at the end of the Pyrenees, anyway. They perform quite well. They win a number of victories, and yes, they are forced back into Spain. They keep the French confined to a very, very narrow strip of territory in Catalonia. Yes, at the very end of the war, the French break through at the other end of the Pyrenees and actually advance as far as River Ebro. But actually, it's a creditable performance militarily. However, the economic impact of the war is obviously very serious, heavy taxation. And then, for strategic reasons, Spain doesn't just make peace in 1795. She actually forges an alliance with France, which is a resumption of the alliance which had pertained all through the 18th century. But the continued war, which now involves a British blockade and so forth, wreaks havoc on the Spanish economy. But it's not just that. I mean, there's a whole series of natural disasters. There's a terrible earthquake in Granada. There's climate failures. There's, virtually everything you can think of, up to and including plagues of locusts. And the suffering that you have in Spain, which is already a very poor country, a country with a social system which essentially rests on extreme poverty. The impact was dreadful. And then on top of that, you get political turmoil. Like most 18th century monarchies, the Bourbon monarchy was very reformist. This was the age of enlightened absolutism. What enlightened absolutism was about, amongst other things, was zapping the power of the church and the nobility, breaking them as privileged corporations. Spanish Bourbons were no different to anybody else in that. Charles III, who reigned until 1788, was seen as one of the classic enlightened despots. And when his brother takes over, Charles IV, Charles IV was not a dynamic figure at all, but he didn't reverse his brother's policies. And in fact, he appoints a reformist chief minister, Manuel de Godoy. Now, Godoy, the royal favourite, has always come down as one of the
yeah.
I would say evil genius, but nobody would apply the word genius to Godoy. In point of fact, he was actually what he attempts to do is perfectly creditable. He made many enemies, and enlightened absolutism had made many enemies, and essentially many elements in the church and in the upper nobility, above all the titled nobility, Marxists alike, were determined to hit back, and they seize on the figure of the future Ferdinand VII. They seize on him as a sort of figurehead. They intend essentially that when he takes over from his father's gravely sick. Well, repeatedly gravely sick. I mean, he keeps recovering, but he's not a well man, and he's quite old. They hope that they can turn him into a sort of cat's paw. Now, to cut a long story short, this helps to prevent this struggle in the Spanish monarchy. Coincides with Napoleon's decision to intervene in Portugal, sends an army to Portugal, troops into Spain to cover his communications, and then at the beginning of 1808, he decides that he is going to intervene in Spain. He's not quite certain what he's going to do at first. He's not actually certain whether he's going to overthrow the Bourbons. One possibility is accept Ferdinand on the throne instead of his father. So it's a bit vague and misty at first, but eventually he comes down on the side of getting rid of the Bourbons, and lo and behold, the Bourbons are carted off to France, or persuaded to go to France to go to this meeting in Bayonne. What happens in Spain? Back in Spain, the authorities, because Ferdinand incidentally had become king as a result of a military coup in March 1808, just before he goes off to France. The authorities were busy telling everybody, Napoleon's our friend, the French are our friends, there's nothing to worry about, everything's going to be fine. And they were doing that because that was what Ferdinand was telling them to say. This Ferdinand was terrified of alienating Napoleon. Okay. Back in around Spain, you had plenty of individuals who, for one reason or another, had been out of favour with the previous regime. They were adventurers, pure and simple. They were groups with disadvantage. Junior army officers, for example, men who were starved of promotion, paid very little, and they're getting very worried about what the French are up to, and they see resistance as a means of feathering their own nests, building their careers, getting their own back on their superiors, and so on and so forth. And so, first thing that happens is that you get this riot in Madrid on the 2nd of May 1808. Now that's represented as a great heroic insurrection. It's not. It's a riot. It's actually a panic. You get a demonstration which is got up in front of the royal palace by supporters of Ferdinand, who are very anxious to show Napoleon that Ferdinand has strong support. Remember that nobody knows what's going on at this point. And there's nobody has yet come up with the idea that the Bourbons are in danger. It's a question of which Bourbon is going to be on the throne. This demonstration is got up in front of the royal palace. It gets out of hand. A French officer is attacked. Marshal Murat can see what's going on. His headquarters is just down the road. He sends out a squad of grenadiers, and the grenadiers, the only way of crowd control that there was in those days was firing.
Yeah.
They open fire. The crowd panic, rush back into the city, or into the heart of the city. The French are killing everybody. Everybody pours out into the streets armed with whatever they've got. And the French, who are pretty good at putting down insurrections, simply sending troops from all sides and deal with the situation big time. That creates a situation where the authorities are pretty stuck, because they're saying everything's okay. Don't want to fight the French. They're our friends. What these groups do is that they come together and they organise conspiracies in various parts of Spain, and you get the same thing happening in different parts of Spain, but quite independently. Nobody knows what's going on really, apart from where they are themselves. Mixed in with this, you've got representatives of the church and the aristocracy who want to take control of this situation to roll back enlightened absolutism. So you've got this mixture of political forces. Now, when insurrection breaks out, the leaders seem to have thought that there would be no need for a war. They seem to have thought that it would be enough to rattle their sabres and Napoleon would back off. A huge misconception. But I don't think that anybody was seriously planning for a war. It was about demonstrating. It was about show of force, if you like. Now the people had come flooding out onto the streets, all right, but what they'd come flooding out onto the streets for was essentially to get their own back on the people who have been oppressing them. They were out for revenge. They were out for loot. They're not political. They're not there. And I mean, yes, they are motivated by fear of Napoleon, but their idea of war, if it's necessary, is sort of manning the walls of their towns and seeing off the French. Now, Napoleon is not going to take this line down. Napoleon is going to sort things out good and proper. He's announced that Joseph Bonaparte is going to be King of Spain. Once he's done that, he's committed. He can't back off. So you've got a shooting war. In towns and cities around Spain, the leadership, you'd had basically emergency committees called juntas just set up. And they say, oh my God, what have we done? The French are coming. They've also got the mob on the streets. They've got a very, very volatile situation. For two reasons, then, they have to move very quickly to conscription. Conscription is the only way they've got of forming mass armies quickly, and conscription is also a very useful way of getting the crowds off the streets. People talk about thousands of men coming forward and volunteering to fight the French. Point of fact, the number of volunteers is very few. And archival research suggests that there were plenty of Spanish landowners, Spanish merchants, the people called caciques, the bigwigs, if you like, who volunteered their retainers.
Okay.
They had complete economic control, and they simply turn around and say, you're going to send your son to the army. And,
I get it.
And in the documents, you'll see so and so sent so many volunteers to the army, and what that means, you just kick them into doing it. So this war effort goes down like a lead balloon. You've got this vision which is put about, not least indeed in England in 1808.
Mm.
You know, the heroic Spanish people rising in revolt. Point of fact, the heroic Spanish people are massively annoyed. They've got no interest in fighting Bonaparte, really. You know, this is almost a sort of genuinely revolutionary situation. They object massively to being conscripted. Remember, many of these people have lived all their lives in little mountain villages in the middle of nowhere. And the next valley is a foreign country. A Gallego from Galicia in the northwest has got nothing in common with a Valenciano from Valencia. They won't even be able to understand each other.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's very little in the way of national consciousness. There's certainly no real concept of having to march off and fight for the fatherland. They're prepared to defend their own homes if their homes are attacked. But being conscripted and marched off to the other end of Spain, and the more so when the system of conscription actually turns out, pretty much inevitably, to be grossly unfair.
Mm-hmm.
If theoretically, you get the introduction of universal conscription,
which is never popular. It's never popular at all.
no. Or actually, what people often did was to play at soldiers. You get the formation of town guards of various sorts, which are recruited only from the propertied classes, and they strut around in wonderful uniforms, playing at soldiers, whilst the bulk of the population are having to do the fighting. In the beginning of 1808, Spain had probably something like 100,000 troops.
Mm-hmm.
By the time that Napoleon launched his own personal counterattack in Spain in November 1808, they still only have about 180,000. You know, so actually the upsurge, you know, it's not like Britain in 1914.
Mm-hmm.
That the old army had been badly disorganized in many instances by the uprising. The new regiments, which are formed of raw recruits, unwilling raw recruits, who are frequently very badly armed, who are officered in many instances by cronies of the provincial juntas, men who've got no aptitude for war, no military training,
Mm-hmm.
and the net result is exactly what you might expect, which is that the French start winning battles hither and yon. Now, in terms of what actually happens in 1808, the French don't have that many troops in the country. They've only got about, if memory serves, 90,000 men in Spain.
Yeah, that rings a bell.
Yeah, they're split up in a series of, well, not small groups perhaps, but that
Widely dispersed.
Yeah, you've got 10,000 men here, 10,000 men there, 20,000 men somewhere else. Then they're not actually in occupation of most of the country. You know, they're in many parts of Spain, you can be hundreds of miles from the nearest Frenchman, which of course adds to the resentment to conscription.
Mm-hmm.
There aren't any French
Yeah.
here. You know, where is this place, Valencia, anyway? Yeah. But the French played the situation very badly, and they, in many instances, they win victories very quickly, but they start to run into problems. In the first instance, they send relatively small columns of troops to occupy places like Valencia, like Zaragoza, like Gerona, for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
And there's only a few thousand men, only got a few field guns, and even medieval walls are enough to see them off. And yes, the populace of Zaragoza, or the inhabitants of Zaragoza and Valencia, Gerona, turn out because they think they're going to be massacred. Because the story's gone around that the Dos de Mayo is about a massacre.
Uh-huh.
The French launches unprovoked attack on the people of Madrid. But elsewhere, and these columns are turned back. But elsewhere, they run into forces of the Spanish regular army, of the old regular army. And the old regular army wasn't nearly as bad as it's been made out to be. And you get the climactic Battle of Bailen in July 1808, and an entire French army is forced to surrender. Now, that victory was a fluke. I won't go into the details of it because it's extraordinarily complex, even by Peninsular War standards. One of those cases where everybody makes the most horrendous mistakes, and the side wins is the one which makes the least. Yes. But certainly the French commander Dupont handled the situation in most appalling fashion. And yeah, I mean it's a victory. Something like 20,000 men are taken prisoner, many of whom haven't fired a shot, incidentally. But it's not the great triumph that is represented. Now, all of this means that when British troops start arriving in Spain, and they go to Portugal first, and of course they drive the French out of Portugal, and they enter Spain, and they suddenly find themselves in a situation for which they weren't prepared in the slightest. They've been told that the Spaniards were heroic and rushing to arms, and of course Moore's army had fairly horrendous experience in the campaign of December 1808 and January 1809, and they blame all their sufferings on the Spaniards. Moore is absolutely scathing in his comments on the Spaniards, and of course this transmits into our record, and it actually, along with Talavera and a few other occasions, forms the basis of what we quote unquote know about the Spanish armies.
That's, I think, an excellent summary of the situation in Spain, and explains about why a man like Cuesta was opposed to certain government policies and orders and what they were trying to do, and also wasn't happy about the military situation either. And when you look at all of that, you understand, as is the point of a lot of your research, as you were saying, you understand why the Spanish armies were unable to perform perhaps as well as they should have been able to.
Yeah, there's a whole series of issues. Let's begin with the generals. Yeah. Does Peninsular War Spain produce Napoleon Bonaparte or a Duke of Wellington? No, absolutely not. Many of the Spanish commanders were frankly anything but first-class generals. They weren't great military minds. They make mistakes. Even the best of them make dreadful mistakes and are rather uninspiring. The worst of them are, frankly, absolutely dreadful. Incidentally, I mean, if we're going back to sort of the way in which the Spaniards are thought about, there's a wonderful Gilbert and Sullivan song from, I think, the Gondoliers about the Duke of Plaza Toro. And the Duke of Plaza Toro heroically leads his armies from behind. and always is the first in retreat. and I mean, it's a wonderful parody, but it's based on Cuesta and so forth.
Ah, right.
Anyway, so yeah, plenty of the Spanish commanders were not very good, but they were in a very, very difficult situation because they had political. It was a war which was run by the civilian authorities. It was the civilian authorities who were cracking the whip and dictating strategy, and they were often ordering the Spanish generals to do things which were near impossible, or in one way or another clipping their wings by suddenly transferring troops from their control to somebody else's control, putting it about that they were cowards. So they would be forced to fight battles, just to prove that they weren't cowards. So there's terrible problems at the level of command and control. You've got armies which are for the most part composed of poorly trained infantry, never have enough cavalry, never have enough artillery, simply because artillery and cavalry are expensive. They never get a chance to build up a cadre of veterans, because almost every time they take the field, they are cut to pieces.
Yeah.
Which means that many men are killed, many men are taken prisoner, many men desert. And so they're constantly having to be rebuilt from scratch. On top of that, you've got to think about the geographical nature of the war. Spain is a country which you conquer from the inside out. If you're coming from France, and obviously, if we launched an invasion of Spain, it'd be a maritime invasion. But if you're coming from France, you've essentially only got two decent routes into Spain. One of them leads from the western end of the Pyrenees to Madrid, to central Spain. The other leads into, which is at the other end of the Pyrenees, leads to Barcelona, and then down the Mediterranean coast. The one that matters is always the one at the western end of the Pyrenees. That's the one that gets you to the heart of the matter. And the French army had no difficulty in getting to Madrid, occupies Madrid right from the beginning, and it's sitting there in a central position. The Spanish forces, by contrast, are in an external position. They're scattered around the periphery of the country. They're expected to launch an offensive strategy. That's what the Spanish political authorities wanted, because the Spanish political authorities were desperate to secure their own positions. That meant that these armies would have to advance from the shelter of the mountains which ring Spain. They'd have to advance into the Meseta, the great rolling high plains. Perfect cavalry country. And they are armies which have very little cavalry.
And that's again more recipes for disaster.
and very, very heavy disaster. Now this leads to a situation. I mean, this goes on. The French retreat in the wake of the Battle of Baylen. They pull back to near the French frontier. Napoleon goes berserk, sends huge numbers of troops to Spain, goes there himself, leads this campaign, which essentially destroys all the Spanish armies in 10 minutes flat. He gets to Madrid, and it's at this point, December 1808, when the British Army for the first time gets involved in Spain. Napoleon retreats from Spain, but throughout 1809 you get the Spanish armies in conjunction with Wellington's army in the summer of 1809. You got a series of basically advances into central Spain. Essentially, converging attacks on Madrid.
Yeah.
Well, they couldn't coordinate anything. There's no way you could do that, and so these offensives go on, and each one is beaten back, usually with heavy losses, and eventually the Spaniards run out of men. They run out of resources. By the beginning of 1810, the cupboard is bare. Conscription was very, very unpopular. It was incredibly difficult to enforce. They weren't getting very many recruits. The armies that they did get were just melting away. They lose endless numbers of muskets, endless numbers of cannon, and eventually there's virtually nothing left. And Wellington, meanwhile, has, in the wake of Talavera, basically said, right, not going to have anything to do with Spain, going to defend Portugal. And the British Army doesn't fire a shot from July 1809 to August 1810.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, in Spain, the French decide that they're going to launch a massive attack on Andalusia, which was, southern Spain. It was the most important area which the Patriots, the Spaniards, still controlled. And they launch in and they conquer the place in 2 weeks flat. They spread out across the province. They take Seville, they take Malaga, and they almost get Cadiz.
Yeah.
But at the last minute, they're foiled by a Spanish general who is perhaps brighter than some of the others and more active than some of the others, and he frantically force marches his troops, and he gets into Cadiz, which didn't have a proper garrison, literally a day before the French arrived. And so Cadiz is saved, and it becomes a capital.
Who is this guy?
He's a chap called the Duke of Albuquerque.
Yes, he's one of the people on the list I wrote down yesterday.
He actually wasn't, in many respects, wasn't much better than other Spanish generals, but he did manage at this point to be the man of the moment, and he saves Cadiz, and he goes on to be Spanish ambassador in London actually for a while. Anyway, now the French are spread out across huge areas of Spain. Those areas of Spain aren't going to be producing resources for the Spanish cause. They aren't going to be producing men for the Spanish cause. The Spanish cause is bankrupt, and now it becomes more bankrupt because in 1810, revolt breaks out in the American colonies.
Yeah, I'm reading about that now, actually, in the book you kindly supplied me.
You get a huge, essentially Indian rebellion in Mexico, which has absolutely nothing to do with Mexican independence. But in Buenos Aires, in Caracas, you get revolts against Spanish authority. And you get essentially the proclamation of an independent Argentina and independent Venezuela. That means that the only source of income that the Spaniards have left, the remittances from America, disappears. Spain is now occupied, bankrupt, very few troops left, and it's that which forms the background to Wellington's campaigns. This is why the British had to do, or the Anglo-Portuguese, I should say, had to do the bulk of the fighting. This is why Spain is effectively liberated by the Anglo-Portuguese. Now, many Spaniards at the time felt humiliated by this.
Yeah, quite reasonably so. Yeah.
Yeah, and Spanish generals in particular felt humiliated by it. And if you want to come up with a reason why Spanish generals have been so interventionist, you can point the finger back to the Peninsular War. That's where the military coup comes from in Spain. Now, of course, Wellington and his troops eventually march into Spain, and they discover that there isn't much in the way of a Spanish army to fight with them. Spanish troops they do get, for the most part, are pretty awful. The one occasion when a Spanish army really distinguishes itself in the company with the Anglo-Portuguese is of course, Albuera in 1811.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Now, the interesting thing about Albuera is that the Spanish troops who fought there had actually been in being, if you like, for about a year and a half. They for various reasons, they hadn't been defeated. They hadn't been doing very much fighting, but they hadn't actually suffered a major defeat, which means that their units possessed far more cohesion as a norm. And they actually do very, very well on the battlefield at Albuera.
They do, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It's who is it in command? Is it Zayas or is it
he's a divisional commander.
Mm-hmm.
You actually get two Spanish armies, two independent Spanish armies which come together to fight at Albuera. Mm-hmm. One's a very small one, commanded by Castanos, who is the general in command at Bailen, actually.
Yeah.
And the other is commanded by a guy called Valestero.
Yeah.
Very different kettle of fish. Castanos was very much a general of the old army.
Mm.
He was a distinguished soldier, had a very long record. He was widely seen as a very decent chap. Actually, he was a very genial man, very generous man. He was much liked by his subordinates. Only a few British actually meet him in an official capacity, but the ones who do, they say, well, he seems a genial old buffer. But he's not very able and he's not very energetic. Ballesteros is a different kettle of fish. Ballesteros had been a junior officer of the Customs Guard in Asturias at the beginning of the war. He is a classic example of somebody who is elevated by the local authorities to high rank. Mm-hmm. Because I haven't got anybody else.
Yeah, I know there's a few Spanish generals that end up that get to high rank because of that, like Mauricio.
Mauricio, he was sergeant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of the Marines, wasn't it, at Trafalgar and things?
Yeah.
But carry on. I'm sorry. I was just.
Yeah. So Ballesteros gets to be a general very quickly, and he is very much a glory hunter. He is very, very much somebody out to make his name. Mm-hmm. He's in a sense he's a Napoleon without a talent.
Yes.
I mean,
there were a lot of them. Yeah.
How else was Napoleon to make his name except by winning battles? Ballesteros is like that, and he cultivates this image of being a very daring, innovative, forward-thinking commander. He, like Palafox, he very quickly understands this good idea to be hand in glove with the press, mm-hmm. And a very favourable picture of him is painted. Now, I mean, frankly, he wasn't much of a general in military terms. The best thing you could say about him was that the troops he brought to the battlefield had at least got a lot of experience in campaigning. He was sent out in command of a detached force in southwestern Spain, and he proceeded to march up and down and lead the French a merry dance, and always managing to stay one jump ahead of them. But at least his troops became, shall I say, campaign hardened, and they do well. But for the most part, the picture's fairly dismal, and this, of course, feeds in still more to this black legend, the idea that Spaniards are useless.
Yeah, I mean, a case can be said that evading the French army in such a situation is winning for the Spanish. It lectured the Russians in 1812, obviously. So there's that for Valesteros. But his troops absolutely do perform well at Albuera, and it's sort of the I don't know, what is it? Sort of a bit of redemption for Spanish arms.
Yeah, absolutely. But even then, they often, don't get the credit they deserve. You get people saying, well, the Spaniards did their best, but they got in the way.
Yeah.
And Wellington himself says that the Spanish troops stood like stocks, as he put it, because they didn't know better. They didn't know what else to do. They could neither advance nor retreat. Now, in a sense, Wellington had it right.
Yeah.
Spanish troops, generally speaking, could not manoeuvre effectively in the face of the enemy. They weren't well trained enough. They tended to fall into disorder very quickly. They tended to end up in a sort of a muddle, basically. If they retreated, they very quickly lost their cohesion, and they went backwards faster and faster. However, give them a chance, put them in a position where all they have to do is stand and fight. It's what you have at Albuera.
Yeah,
and it's a very creditable performance. In fact, it's 4 Spanish battalions take on and check 2 French divisions.
They do, yes, and their stand allows Beresford to get more men over to that side.
Yeah.
And I remember there's things about they did not want to retreat at all either. And
when they're falling back, and they are being driven back as the British arrive, you get officers turning to British and saying, look, we're only retreating because we've run out of ammunition.
Yeah.
And they do seem to have fallen back in fairly good order, and then to have reformed their ranks in the rear of the new British line. Albuera prompts another thought, actually. We talked a lot about how many British historians have been unfair. Unfortunately, you get a reaction in Spain, and so you get Spaniards producing an equally distorted view the other way around. It's not just a British problem. It's mutual ignorance. It's mutual incomprehension. The British don't understand the problems that the Spaniards were facing, and the Spaniards don't understand the problems that the British were facing. So there's a lot of mutual incomprehension.
Yeah, glad you mentioned that, because I was going to ask about the other side of the coin anyway.